The ink-stained fingers of Hannah Cooper trembled as the angry mob surged toward the small wooden building that housed Fort Smith's only newspaper office. Through the grimy window, she could see them coming, men with torches, women with scowls, and Reverend Thatcher leading them all, a copy of her poetry collection clutched in his bony fist like a weapon. Arkansas, 1876. Fort Smith had welcomed the railroad, but not Hannah's words. Burn it. Burn the sinful scribblings. The Reverend's voice carried through the closed door. Hannah frantically gathered her papers, stuffing them into her satchel. At 23, she dreamed of bringing literary enlightenment to this dusty frontier town. Instead, her poetry about desire, freedom, and questioning faith had caused a scandal that threatened to become dangerous. The bell above the door jangled as someone entered. Hannah spun around, expecting the furious face of Reverend Thatcher, but instead saw a tall man with trail dust on his boots and a worn Stetson in his hands. "Madam, there's a mob forming outside. I reckon you might need assistance." His voice was low, steady, as if angry mobs were merely an inconvenience rather than a threat. "Are you here to help them burn my work, sir?" Hannah asked, clutching her satchel tighter. The man's lips quirked up slightly. "No, madam, name's Hank Sutton. I've got a wagon out back." "If you're amenable, we can leave before they decide to do more than just yell." The pounding on the door grew louder. Hannah glanced at the typesetting machine, her employer Mr. Finch's pride and joy. "I cannot leave. This is Mr. Finch's livelihood." "Mr. Finch is at the saloon telling everyone how he never should have let a woman write for his paper," Hank said bluntly. "Especially not one who pens words that corrupt the moral fabric of society." Hannah's cheeks burned with embarrassment and anger. "My poetry is not," a rock crashed through the window, sending glass shards flying. Hank moved with surprising speed, pulling Hannah behind the large desk. "Time's up, Miss Cooper. Decision time." The back door was just 20 feet away. Freedom, or at least escape, beckoned. "Very well, Mr. Sutton." She clutched her satchel tighter. "Lead the way." Hank grabbed her hand and they ran, slipping out the back door just as the front door splintered open. His wagon was there as promised, a team of 2 sturdy horses waiting patiently. He helped her up and climbed aboard, snapping the reins before she could even settle properly. "Where are we going?" Hannah asked, looking back at the angry crowd now pouring from the newspaper office. "Somewhere they won't look right away," Hank replied, guiding the horses down an alley. "My sister's boarding house on the edge of town, just until things cool down." The wagon rattled over the uneven street, each jolt making Hannah more aware of how quickly her life had unraveled. Just yesterday, she'd been Fort Smith's first female journalist, albeit one who published poetry under a pseudonym. Today, she was fleeing an angry mob. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, studying his profile. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way. His nose had clearly been broken at least once, and a scar ran along his jawline, but there was something compelling about his steady gaze. "I don't much care for mobs," he said simply. "Or for folks who think they've got the right to decide what others can say or think." They turned onto a quieter street lined with modest homes. Fort Smith had grown substantially since the railroad came through, but it still retained the rawness of a frontier town. A place where justice could be swift and mercy scarce. "They found out I wrote the poetry," Hannah explained, though he hadn't asked. "Someone discovered my journal and showed the Reverend." Hank nodded. "I heard, too sinful to be read in decent company, they're saying." Hannah's spine stiffened. "There's nothing sinful about truth, about questioning, about, you don't need to convince me, Miss Cooper." Hank slowed the horses as they approached a 2-story white clapboard house with a neat garden. "I'm not much for poetry myself, but I reckon folks should be allowed to write what they please." The boarding house was quiet when they arrived, most residents away at work or involved in the excitement downtown. Hank's sister, Martha, was a practical woman with graying hair and kind eyes who asked few questions when her brother appeared with a flustered young woman in tow. "The blue room is empty," she told him after a brief introduction. "Stay as long as needed." Later that evening, after a simple dinner of stew and cornbread, Hannah found herself sitting on the back porch with Hank. The night was warm, fireflies dancing in the garden, the distant sound of piano music drifting from town. "They burned my poems," Hannah said quietly, having heard the news from another boarder. "Made a bonfire right in the street." Hank was silent for a long moment, rolling a cigarette between his fingers without lighting it. Words don't burn so easy, though, not once they've been read. Few have read them, that's the irony, they're condemning what they haven't even seen. Hank turned to look at her then, his eyes reflecting the lantern light from inside. "Will you read them to me?" Hannah blinked in surprise. "I beg your pardon, your poetry." "The ones they claim are too sinful to read." His expression was open, curious. "I'd like to make up my own mind if you're willing." No one had ever asked her to read her poetry aloud before. Hannah had always written for herself, only recently daring to publish anonymously in Mr. Finch's newspaper. The idea of reading her most intimate thoughts to this near stranger made her pulse quicken. "They're not what most would consider proper," she warned. "Miss Cooper, I've spent 10 years driving cattle from Texas to Montana. Proper isn't something I'm overly concerned with." Hannah hesitated, then reached for her satchel. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her neat handwriting. She selected one of the poems that had caused the most outrage, a piece about a woman who refused to be silenced by society's expectations. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each stanza. The words flowed from her lips like water over stones, smooth in some places, turbulent in others. She spoke of desire without shame, of questioning faith without fear, of a woman's thoughts unfettered by men's approval. When she finished, Hannah couldn't bring herself to look at Hank. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant hooting of an owl. Finally, he spoke. "That's not sinful, Miss Cooper. That's honest." Something shifted inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Most don't see it that way." "Most don't want honesty from women," he replied. "Makes it harder to keep things as they are." Hannah looked up at him then, studying his face in the dim light. "And you, Mr. Sutton, what do you want from women, same as from men?" "Truth when it matters, kindness when possible, and to be left alone when I prefer it." He smiled slightly. "Though I admit, I wouldn't mind hearing another poem if you're willing." For the next hour, Hannah read from her journal while Hank listened, occasionally asking questions or offering observations that surprised her with their insight. They spoke of poetry and cattle drives, of Hannah's childhood in Boston and Hank's years on the frontier. The conversation flowed easily, like they were old friends rather than people who had met under duress hours earlier. "Why Fort Smith?" Hank asked eventually. "Seems an unlikely place for a poet from Boston." Hannah traced the leather binding of her journal. "My father died last year, left debts. There was a position here as a typesetter and occasional contributor to the newspaper. The wages were fair, and I thought I might find something here that I couldn't in Boston." "And have you?" She looked out at the darkness beyond the porch. "I found that people are the same everywhere, afraid of what they don't understand, quick to condemn what challenges their beliefs." "Not everyone," Hank said quietly. Hannah smiled slightly. "No, not everyone." The next morning brought unwelcome news. Reverend Thatcher had convinced the town council to pass an emergency ordinance against literature of immoral character, specifically naming Hannah's work. Mr. Finch had publicly fired her, and there was talk of pressing charges for public indecency. "You need to leave Fort Smith," Martha told her over breakfast, her expression grave, "at least until this blows over." "And go where?" Hannah asked, her toast untouched on her plate. "I have no family, little money, and apparently a reputation that precedes me." "I'm heading to Caldwell tomorrow," Hank said, entering the kitchen with a stack of firewood. "Cattle season starting. You'd be welcome to ride along, get a fresh start somewhere new." Hannah stared at him. Caldwell, Kansas was another frontier town, but one without Reverend Thatcher and his moral crusade. Still, traveling alone with a man she barely knew. "It's not proper," she said finally. Hank raised an eyebrow. "Wasn't it your poetry about rejecting such constraints that caused all this trouble?" Martha snorted with laughter, then quickly composed herself when Hannah looked her way. "He has a point, dear, and Hank is trustworthy despite his rough edges." By evening, Hannah had made her decision. With few options and the gossip growing more vicious by the hour, the idea of a fresh start grew more appealing. She packed her meager belongings, wrote a scathing letter to Mr. Finch that she knew she'd never send, and prepared to leave the town that had so quickly turned against her. Dawn had barely broken when they set out the next day. Hannah wore her sturdiest dress and boots, a wide-brimmed hat protecting her face from the sun. Beside her, Hank handled the wagon with ease, the horses setting a steady pace northward. "Have you ever been to Kansas?" he asked as Fort Smith disappeared behind them. Hannah shook her head. "I've never been west of the Mississippi until coming to Arkansas. It's different there, newer, people are making it up as they go along." He adjusted his hat against the rising sun. "Might be a good place for a poet." "Or it might be exactly like Fort Smith," Hannah replied. "People are people wherever you go." Hank considered this. True enough, but sometimes a fresh audience makes all the difference. They traveled all day, stopping occasionally to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky, biscuits, and dried fruit. Hannah was surprised by how comfortable she felt in Hank's company, despite the impropriety of their situation. He was a man of few words but seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, asking questions about her poetry and listening carefully to her answers. As evening approached, they made camp near a small creek. Hank efficiently set up a fire and prepared a more substantial meal of beans and salt pork while Hannah arranged her bedroll on one side of the wagon. "You've done this before," she observed, watching him work. "Many times, been driving cattle and freight since I was 16. He stirred the beans. "My pa died in the war, Union soldier, left my ma with 5 kids and not much else. I was the oldest." Hannah sat on a fallen log, warming her hands by the fire. "My father was a professor of literature at Harvard. He would have been appalled by my current circumstances. Traveling with a disreputable cowboy, being run out of town for poetry," she corrected, though she smiled. "Though yes, the cowboy would have concerned him too." Hank passed her a tin plate of food. "What would he have thought of your poetry?" Hannah considered this as she accepted the plate. "He encouraged my writing, but he was a traditional man. I think he would have been shocked by my more honest work. He believed women should express themselves, but within certain boundaries. And you don't believe in those boundaries." It wasn't a question, but Hannah answered anyway. "I believe truth is truth, regardless of who speaks it. A woman's desire is no less real or valid than a man's. Her questions about God, about society, about her place in the world, these deserve to be heard." Hank nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "That's why they feared your words. Because once spoken, they can't be unheard." They ate in companionable silence after that, the sounds of the wilderness surrounding them. Later, as Hannah prepared to retire to her bedroll, Hank remained by the fire. "I'll keep watch," he said when she questioned him. "Get some rest." Hannah slept surprisingly well, lulled by the distant sound of night birds and the occasional soft movements of Hank tending the fire. She woke at dawn to find him already preparing coffee, looking no worse for his night awake. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked, accepting a steaming cup. "When necessary," he replied with a slight smile. "We should reach the next town by nightfall. There's a decent hotel where you can have a proper bed." They continued their journey, the landscape gradually changing as they traveled. Hannah found herself composing poems in her head about the vast sky, the rolling prairie, the sense of possibility that seemed to expand with each mile. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. "Storm's coming," Hank observed, his expression concerned. "We need to find shelter. There's an old way station about an hour ahead if we push the horses." They increased their pace, but the storm moved faster. Within 30 minutes, fat raindrops began to fall, quickly becoming a downpour that soaked through Hannah's cloak. The wind howled around them, making conversation impossible. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by deafening thunder. The way station appeared just as Hannah was certain they would drown in the deluge, a small, abandoned building that had once served as a stagecoach stop. Its roof was mostly intact, though the windows were broken and the door hung crookedly from rusted hinges. Hank quickly unhitched the horses and led them into the attached lean-to, while Hannah hurried inside with their essential supplies. The interior was dusty and bare except for a dilapidated table and bench, but it was dry and out of the wind. "Not the hotel I promised," Hank said ruefully as he entered, water streaming from his hat and coat. "But it'll do until the storm passes." Hannah wrung water from her skirt, shivering despite herself. "It's perfectly adequate. I'm just grateful to be out of that rain." Hank immediately set about making a small fire in what remained of the hearth, using dry wood from a pile someone had left behind. Soon, warmth and light filled the small space, making it almost cozy despite its derelict state. They hung their wet outer garments near the fire to dry and sat close to the flames, sharing the last of Martha's biscuits and some jerky. The storm continued to rage outside, showing no signs of abating. "Looks like we'll be here a while," Hank said, stoking the fire. "Might as well get comfortable." As darkness fell, the abandoned way station became an island of warmth in a sea of stormy darkness. Hannah found herself strangely content despite their circumstances. There was something freeing about being so far from civilization, from the judgment and restrictions she'd always known. "Will you read me another poem?" Hank asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Hannah hesitated. Her journal was one of the few things that had stayed dry, protected in her oilskin satchel. "Are you sure you want to hear more of my sinful words, Mr. Sutton?" His eyes met hers across the fire. "I think I need to hear them more than ever, Miss Cooper." Something in his voice made her heart beat faster. Hannah reached for her journal, finding a poem she'd written on her journey to Fort Smith, a piece about a woman embracing her own desires without shame, about the freedom found in honest passion. Her voice was steady as she read, the words flowing like the rain outside. She didn't look at Hank, focusing instead on the dancing flames, but she could feel his gaze on her face, intent and unwavering. When she finished, the silence between them felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. Hannah finally looked up to find Hank watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "That's not sinful," he said finally, his voice rough. "That's beautiful." Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "Most would disagree. I'm not most people." He moved to sit beside her on the rough bench. "Neither are you." Their shoulders touched, a simple contact that somehow felt more intimate than anything Hannah had experienced before. Outside, the storm raged on, lightning illuminating the broken windows in brief, brilliant flashes. "May I?" Hank asked, gesturing to her journal. Wordlessly, Hannah handed it to him. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, sending an unexpected shiver through her body. Hank carefully turned the pages, reading silently, his expression thoughtful. "You see the world differently," he said at last. "You put into words things most people are afraid to even think." "Is that good or bad?" Hannah asked. Hank looked up from the journal, his eyes meeting hers. "It's rare and valuable, and yes, frightening to those who prefer the comfort of accepted truths. Like Reverend Thatcher." "Like most people," he handed the journal back to her. "Fear is easier than understanding." Hannah accepted the journal, their fingers touching again. This time, neither pulled away immediately. "And you, Mr. Sutton, do my words frighten you?" "No," he said simply. "They make me see things I hadn't considered before. That's not frightening. That's a gift." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different backgrounds. Hannah had never met anyone who accepted her words so completely, who seemed to understand what she was trying to express without judgment or discomfort. The fire crackled between them as the storm continued outside. They talked late into the night, about books Hank had read during long cattle drives, about Hannah's dreams of publishing her work someday, about the changing frontier and what it meant for people seeking new beginnings. When Hannah finally lay down to sleep, wrapped in her bedroll near the fire, she felt a curious sense of peace despite their uncertain circumstances. Across the room, Hank kept watch again, his silhouette outlined against the dying firelight. "Good night, Mr. Sutton," she said softly. "Good night, Miss Cooper," he replied. "Dream of words no one can burn." Morning brought sunshine and the aftermath of the storm muddy roads that would make travel difficult. They ate a simple breakfast and prepared to continue their journey, though Hank warned it would be slow going. "The next town is still a good day's ride," he explained as they loaded the wagon. "We might need to make camp again tonight." Hannah nodded, secretly not minding the prospect. There was something about traveling with Hank that made her feel more alive than she had in years more herself, somehow. As predicted, their progress was slow. The wagon wheels sank into mud repeatedly, requiring both of them to help free it. By midday, they were exhausted and had covered less than half the distance Hank had hoped for. They paused for a brief meal beside a creek swollen with rainwater. Hannah washed the mud from her hands and face, grimacing at her bedraggled appearance. "I must look a fright," she said, attempting to smooth her wild hair. Hank was watching her, a curious expression on his face. "You look like a poem come to life," he said, then immediately looked embarrassed by his own words. "I mean, you look fine, Miss Cooper." Hannah felt warmth bloom in her chest at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you, Mr. Sutton. That's quite poetic for a man who claims not to understand poetry." He shrugged, turning his attention back to the horses. "Maybe I'm learning." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the road gradually improving as the sun dried the mud. By evening, they had made reasonable progress, but were still far from the next town. They made camp in a small grove of trees, the routine now familiar between them. As they sat by the fire after dinner, Hannah found herself studying Hank's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. He was unlike any man she had known in Boston or even in Fort Smith. There was a straightforward honesty to him that she found refreshing. "You're staring, Miss Cooper," he said without looking at her, a hint of amusement in his voice. Hannah didn't look away. "I'm observing, it's different." "And what are you observing?" A man who doesn't seem concerned with appearing to be something he's not. She wrapped her arms around her knees. "It's refreshing." Hank turned to face her then. "Out here, pretense gets stripped away pretty quick. Nature doesn't care about your fancy words or fine clothes, neither do most of the people who have chosen this life." "Is that why you chose it? This life?" He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks upward. "Partly. After the war, things were different. My pa didn't come home. Towns were full of men who'd seen too much death. The open country seemed cleaner somehow. And now," Hank was silent for a long moment. "Now I sometimes wonder if I've seen enough of the open country, if maybe there's something to be said for putting down roots somewhere." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Hannah found herself thinking about his words long after they'd retired for the night. There was something happening between them, something unspoken, but growing stronger with each passing day. The next morning brought new challenges. One of the horses had developed a limp, slowing their progress even further. By noon, it was clear they wouldn't reach town before nightfall. "There's a homestead about 5 miles ahead," Hank said, studying the horizon. "Belongs to a family I helped last year when their cattle broke free during a storm. They might put us up for the night, give the horse a chance to rest." The Macpherson family welcomed them warmly, a Scottish couple with 3 young children who seemed delighted by unexpected visitors. Mrs. Macpherson clucked over Hannah's travel-worn appearance and immediately offered her a bath and clean clothes. "It's not much," she said apologetically, showing Hannah to a small bedroom, "but it's private and the bed is clean." The luxury of a proper bath and clean clothes restored Hannah's spirits considerably. Mrs. Macpherson had lent her a simple calico dress that fit reasonably well and even helped her arrange her hair in a neat braid. "Your husband seems a good man, Mrs. Macpherson commented as they prepared dinner together. Quiet but kind, Hannah nearly dropped the potatoes she was peeling. "Oh, Mr. Sutton isn't my husband. He's escorting me to Caldwell, Mrs. Macpherson raised her eyebrows but said nothing further, though Hannah could see the questions in her eyes. It was improper, of course, for an unmarried woman to travel alone with a man not related to her, but circumstances had left her few options. Dinner was a lively affair, with the Macpherson children peppering Hank with questions about his travels and adventures. He answered patiently, occasionally catching Hannah's eye across the table with a small smile that made her heart beat faster. After the children were in bed, the adults sat around the fire with coffee. Mr. Macpherson, learning of Hannah's writing, asked to hear some of her work. "Only if you wish to," he added quickly. I've always had a fondness for poetry, though I've little opportunity to hear it out here. Hannah hesitated, looking at Hank. He nodded encouragingly. Your words deserve to be heard, he said simply. So Hannah read not her most controversial work, but poems about the beauty of the prairie, the strength found in solitude, the way the land shaped the people who lived upon it. The Macphersons listened attentively, their faces reflecting appreciation and understanding. That's mighty fine, Mr. Macpherson said when she finished. You've a gift for capturing what the rest of us can only feel but not express. Mrs. Macpherson wiped a tear from her eye. Reminds me of home, somehow, though the words speak of this land. Later, as they prepared for bed Hannah in the small guest room, Hank in the barn with the horses, she found herself thinking about how differently the Macphersons had received her poetry compared to the people of Fort Smith. Different audiences, Hank said when she mentioned this the next morning as they continued their journey. The Macphersons have had to rebuild their lives from nothing. They understand transformation, renewal. Your poetry speaks to that. And what does my poetry speak to in you? Hannah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Hank was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, possibility, the idea that we might become more than what we've been told we are. The road improved as they traveled, allowing them to make better time. By late afternoon, they could see the distant buildings of a small town on the horizon. That's not Caldwell, Hannah observed, confused. No, it's Deer Creek, still about 2 days from Caldwell. Hank adjusted the reins, but they've got a decent hotel and a general store where we can resupply. Deer Creek proved to be a small but bustling settlement, a waypoint for travelers and a supply center for nearby farms and ranches. The hotel was modest but clean, and for the first time in days, Hannah enjoyed the luxury of a private room with a proper bed. After refreshing herself, she met Hank in the hotel's small dining room for dinner. He had clearly taken the opportunity to clean up as well, his hair still damp from washing, his clothes relatively free of trail dust. Something about seeing him in this more civilized setting made Hannah uncomfortably aware of her attraction to him, an attraction that had been growing steadily during their journey. I took the liberty of asking about employment opportunities in Caldwell, Hank said as they ate. There's a newspaper there, the Caldwell Post. They might be interested in someone with your experience. Hannah looked up from her plate, surprised. You did that for me, he shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. Seemed practical. You'll need work when you get there. Thank you, she said sincerely. That was thoughtful. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been developing since that first night on Martha's porch. After dinner, they walked through the small town, enjoying the simple pleasure of civilization after days on the trail. The evening was warm, the sky painted with the spectacular colors of a prairie sunset. It's beautiful here, Hannah said, watching the sun sink below the horizon. So different from Boston, from anywhere I've been. It grows on you, Hank agreed. The space, the freedom. They stopped at the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. In the distance, a herd of wild horses moved across the grassland, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. Will you read me another poem? Hank asked quietly. One you haven't shared before, Hannah hesitated. Most of her unpublished work was deeply personal reflections on loneliness, desire, the yearning for connection that she rarely admitted even to herself. I have one, she said finally, but it's different from what I've read to you before. They sat on a fallen log at the edge of town, the last light of day gilding everything in soft gold. Hannah took out her journal and found a poem she'd written during their journey, a piece about unexpected connections, about finding understanding in unlikely places, about the quiet fire of desire that could ignite between two souls who recognized something essential in each other. Her voice was soft as she read, the words intimate in the gathering darkness. She didn't look at Hank, afraid of what she might see in his face or worse, what she might not see. When she finished, silence stretched between them. Hannah finally risked a glance at him and found Hank watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. That wasn't in your journal before, he said, his voice low. No, she admitted. I wrote it recently. Is it about us? The directness of his question didn't surprise her. It was part of what she'd come to appreciate about him, his unwillingness to hide behind social niceties. Hannah took a deep breath. Yes. Hank moved closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. I'm not good with words like you are, Hannah. I can't put what I feel into poetry. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice made something flutter inside her chest. You don't need to, she said softly, but I need you to understand. His eyes searched hers in the fading light. These days with you, they've been the most alive I've felt in years, maybe ever. Hannah's heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. I feel the same. Hank reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek. I don't have much to offer a woman like you. I'm just a cowboy with some savings and dreams that may never come true. And what are those dreams? Hannah asked, leaning slightly into his touch. Land of my own. A home. Work that doesn't keep me moving all the time. He smiled slightly. Maybe someone to share it with who sees the world in poetry. The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that moved Hannah deeply. This man, who had rescued her from an angry mob and listened to her most intimate thoughts without judgment, was offering her a glimpse of his heart. I used to dream of literary salons in Boston, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Recognition, a room of intellectuals discussing my work. And now, his hand was still against her cheek, warm and steady. Now I dream of freedom, of honest words, of being understood. Hannah met his gaze directly. I've found more of that with you in these few days than in years of trying to fit into Boston society. The kiss, when it came, was gentle, a question more than a demand. Hannah answered by leaning closer, her hand finding his shoulder as their lips met in the gathering twilight. It was a moment of perfect understanding, of connection that transcended words. When they finally pulled apart, Hank rested his forehead against hers. I don't want to take you to Caldwell and leave you there, he admitted. I want more time to know you, to understand your poetry and the woman who writes it. Then don't leave, Hannah said simply. Stay, or take me with you when you go. The boldness of her own words shocked her, but they were honest, more honest than she'd been with anyone before him. Propriety demanded caution, distance, careful negotiations of courtship. But Hannah had left propriety behind in Fort Smith, along with so many other constraints. Hank pulled back slightly, searching her face in the dim light. Are you sure? People will talk, they always do. Hannah laughed softly. Let them. I've already been run out of one town for my improper thoughts. What's one more scandal? He smiled then, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his face. Hannah Cooper, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever met. They walked back to the hotel hand in hand, aware of curious glances but beyond caring. Whatever came next, they would face it together, the poet and the cowboy who had found in each other something neither had expected to find. The next morning brought practical considerations. They would continue to Caldwell as planned, but with new intentions. Hank spoke of a small ranch for sale outside town, land he'd considered buying before but hadn't had reason enough to settle. It's nothing fancy, he told Hannah over breakfast. A small house, good water, enough land for some cattle and horses, room to grow. It sounds perfect, Hannah replied, her heart full of possibilities she'd never considered before meeting him. They set out after breakfast, the road ahead clearer than it had been in days. Their conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences and occasional touches, his hand covering hers, her head resting against his shoulder when the road was smooth. By evening, they had covered significant distance. As they made camp for what would likely be their last night on the trail, there was a new intimacy between them, not physical but emotional. The barriers had fallen away, leaving only truth between them. After dinner, they sat side by side watching the stars emerge, countless points of light in the vast prairie sky. Hannah had her journal open, writing by the light of the fire, occasionally reading lines aloud for Hank's reaction. I want to publish a book of poetry someday, she told him, closing the journal. Not anonymously, under my own name. Hank nodded, unsurprised. You should. The world needs your words, even if parts of it aren't ready to hear them yet. Will you read it when it's finished? He smiled. I'll read every word, as many times as you want me to. The promise hung between them, simple but profound. Hannah leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. Above them, a shooting star streaked across the sky, a brief, brilliant moment of light. Make a wish, Hank murmured. Hannah closed her eyes but found she didn't need to wish for anything. Everything she wanted was already here or within reach: freedom, understanding, love that accepted all of her, even the parts others had deemed too sinful to acknowledge. They reached Caldwell the following afternoon. The town was larger than Fort Smith, busier, with the energy of a place still defining itself. The cattle season was just beginning, bringing cowboys and cattle buyers from across the country. Their first stop was the newspaper office. The editor of the Caldwell Post was a middle-aged man named Edward Bailey, who listened with interest as Hannah explained her background and experience. We could use someone with typesetting experience, he said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. And I wouldn't mind publishing some poetry now and then, gives the paper a touch of culture. My poetry has been considered controversial, Hannah warned, determined not to repeat her experience in Fort Smith. Bailey chuckled. Miss Cooper, this is a cattle town. We've seen and heard just about everything. Besides, a little controversy sells papers. With the promise of employment secured, they next visited the bank where Hank inquired about the ranch he'd mentioned. It was still available, though the price had increased slightly since he'd last inquired. We'll take it, he said without hesitation, surprising the banker and Hannah equally. Hank, she whispered as the banker went to prepare the paperwork, are you certain it's a significant decision? He took her hands in his. I've never been more certain of anything. But it's not just my decision. His eyes searched hers. This would be our home, Hannah, if that's what you want. The implication was clear. He was asking not just about the ranch, but about a life together. Hannah thought of Boston, of Fort Smith, of all the places she'd tried to belong without quite succeeding. Yes, she said simply. That's what I want, a home. With you. The banker returned, eyebrows rising slightly at their clasped hands, but he said nothing as Hank completed the purchase. By sunset, they were the owners of the Willow Creek Ranch, 150 acres of good land with a modest house, a barn, and endless possibilities. They stayed in town that night, in separate rooms at the hotel, maintaining at least the appearance of propriety. In the morning, they would go to their new home, but first, there was one more important matter to address. Will you marry me, Hannah? Hank asked as they walked back from dinner, the street quiet around them. Not because it's expected or proper, but because I love you. Because I want to build a life with you. Hannah stopped walking, turning to face him fully. Is that what this is, love? What else would you call it? He asked simply. She considered the question seriously. Understanding, acceptance, desire. A smile curved her lips. Yes, love seems the right word for all of that together. Is that a yes? Hannah stood on tiptoe and kissed him, a brief, sweet contact that held the promise of more to come. Yes, Hank Sutton, I will marry you. They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the town's small church. Martha arrived just in time, having received Hank's telegram from Deer Creek. She brought with her a trunk of Hannah's belongings from Fort Smith and news that the scandal had already been forgotten, replaced by newer gossip. The ranch house was simple but solid, a 2-bedroom structure with a large kitchen and a front porch that faced the sunset. Together, they made it a home, adding bookshelves for Hannah's growing collection and a desk by the window where she could write. Hannah began work at the Caldwell Post, setting type 3 days a week and contributing poetry and occasional articles. To her surprise and delight, her work was well received. Editor Bailey even encouraged her to compile her poems for publication. People out here appreciate honesty, he told her after publishing one of her more provocative pieces. Even when it makes them uncomfortable, maybe especially then. Hank purchased cattle and horses, building their stock slowly and carefully. He hired 2 young cowboys to help with the larger jobs, but handled most of the daily work himself. Some evenings he returned home exhausted, but never too tired to listen as Hannah read her latest work. Their first year together passed in a blur of hard work, adjustment, and deepening love. They learned each other's habits and histories, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their future. Sometimes they argued, Hannah's independent streak clashing with Hank's protective instincts, or his practical nature with her more idealistic views, but they always found their way back to understanding. On their first anniversary, Hank presented Hannah with a gift, a beautiful leather-bound book, its pages blank. "For your first proper collection," he explained. "It's time the world heard your voice." Hannah spent the winter compiling and refining her poetry, selecting pieces that represented her journey from Boston society girl to frontier woman. The resulting collection, Unfettered, was raw and honest, beautiful and challenging. Editor Bailey helped her find a publisher in Chicago who specialized in new voices. When the first printed copies arrived in Caldwell, Hannah held the book with trembling hands, hardly able to believe her words had found their way into the world. "Read it to me," Hank requested that night, sitting beside her on their porch swing as the sun set over their land. "All of it, like you did that first night," so Hannah read, her voice growing stronger with each poem. She read about constraint and freedom, desire and fulfillment, the beauty of the prairie and the man who had helped her find her place in it. When she finished, Hank took the book gently from her hands and set it aside. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I'm proud of you," he murmured against her hair. "So damn proud." Hannah nestled against him, content in a way she'd never imagined possible. "Thank you for asking me to read to you that night. For listening when others only wanted to judge." "Best thing I ever did," Hank replied simply. Asking a beautiful, dangerous poet to share her sinful words with a simple cowboy, Hannah laughed softly. "There's nothing simple about you, Hank Sutton." He kissed her then, still with the same reverence as their first kiss, but now with the familiarity of a love that had grown deeper with each passing day. Life on the prairie wasn't always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, economic challenges and personal disappointments. The following spring brought both joy and heartbreak when Hannah miscarried their first child. Through it all, they held fast to each other and to the life they were building. Hannah's poetry reflected these experiences, the grief, the joy, the quiet moments of ordinary life made extraordinary by love. Her second collection, published 2 years after the first, received even more acclaim. In their third year at Willow Creek, Hannah gave birth to a healthy son they named James, after Hank's father. Watching her husband cradle their child, Hannah felt a completeness she'd never imagined possible when she fled Fort Smith with a stranger who wanted to hear her sinful poetry. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, 5-month-old James sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside them, Hannah took out her journal. "I have a new poem," she said. "Would you like to hear it?" Hank smiled, the same smile that had captivated her from the beginning, open, honest, appreciative of everything she was. Always. She read him words of love and gratitude, of passion and partnership, of two unlikely souls finding in each other exactly what they needed. When she finished, Hank was silent for a long moment, his eyes suspiciously bright in the fading light. "That's not sinful at all," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Hannah closed her journal, smiling at the man who had changed her life with a simple request. "No," she agreed. "That's just truth." As darkness fell over Willow Creek Ranch, Hannah Cooper Sutton, poet, wife, mother, and woman utterly herself, leaned against the shoulder of her cowboy husband, content in the knowledge that she had found a place where her voice could be heard, her heart understood, and her truth valued for exactly what it was. Not sin, but honesty. Not corruption, but courage. Not a threat to society, but a gift to those willing to listen. And in the end, that was all any poet could ask for, not universal approval, but the deep understanding of even one person who would say, "Will you read it to me?" and mean it with their whole heart.